Welcome to Planet Vero Radio, recorded at the Idea Garden Advertising Studios in Vero Beach. This is the Story of Liberty with your host, John Bona.
Good evening and welcome to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me are Jennifer Featherstone and the little Polish farmer from Wisconsin, Dan Williamson. How you doing?
Good evening.
How's the weather up there, Dan?
Well, you know, John, it's mighty cold up here in the north. It's trying to be cold, but we haven't got any snow. So my kids are all kind of praying that we'd get a nice big snowstorm. You know, when our kids are born, we give them hockey skates, cross-country skis, and downhill skis right at birth. They simply need to know how to enjoy 9 months of winter, because that's what we get. So they're looking for the snow for Christmas.
Well, that's great. You know, we are too, but we're not going to get any down here. The probabilities are 1,000,000 to 1, but send a truckload down for us. We'll
truck one down. We'll throw it in a cooler.
We're getting ready, you know, for the not too far away, about 6 weeks out on February 7th, is the 8th annual Vero Beach Prayer Breakfast. And, Dan, I know you were down here last year. You actually spoke at it. And
actually, I've been at that prayer breakfast, 7 of 8 times?
You have, yeah.
It's a great event.
Seen you there every year. And this year we actually have Billy Graham's daughter, Ann Lotz Graham, is the keynote, and other members of the Graham family, too. A couple of the grandsons will be there. And it's kind of interesting what I learned from one of the nephews who will also be there, Mel Graham, is that they used to vacation here in Vero Beach when they were youngsters. Billy used to bring them, I think it was over to the Holiday Inn here on the ocean, and they vacationed. Every year they'd come to Vero Beach as a family. And so it's kind of interesting. They're all coming back. Billy probably won't be here. You know, he's, I think, 93 now. But we're excited about that, Jenna. You know, it's the 8th annual, and we'll be at Riverside Park, again, in a large tent, almost the size of a football field. And we're expecting, 1,500 people thereabouts.
If you're interested in coming, you can go to verobeachprayerbreakfast.com and purchase your tickets. Or you can go to vbpb.com and purchase your tickets. And right there, they're about $25 a ticket. And you get a full breakfast, coffee, pastries. I believe we're doing a quiche this year. And we're having a nice, big, unobstructed tent this year. So it's going to be wonderful.
Yeah, and the great gospel singer, Wintley Phipps, will be providing all the inspirational music. We're so excited about that. Wintley, I just talked to him yesterday. He just got back from Germany, where he performed at the European National Prayer Breakfast. And, Wintley has sung for every president since Ronald Reagan. And at the National Prayer Breakfast, he was the last one to sing on America's soil for Mother Teresa before she went back home. And so it's great to have arguably the greatest gospel singer in America, in my opinion.
He's amazing.
Wintley Phipps, yeah. Nobody sings Amazing Grace like Wintley. He's incredible. So we're happy. And Dan, I'm glad you'll be making the trip all the way from Wisconsin to come down.
I'll be there to move tables around or whatever you need me to. Maybe keep the power going. Once in a while, we've had the power go out, and that's been a little excitement. But I'll be there to do whatever you need me to do.
Yeah.
That was an amazing story, actually, that one time. We were all very nervous about the power going out, and Dan went out there to the electrical box and laid his hands on the box and said, "Lord, bring the power back on." And that power went right back on, amazingly enough. One of the greatest things I've seen in a long time.
I'll tell you, it was scary inside the tent. Everything got dark because it was a large structured tent and with no cathedral windows. And it went dark for about 10 seconds, but then after you prayed, it went back on. So
And it stayed just long enough to the end, and then we opened the box later, and it was all melted. So
That was amazing. That was amazing.
That was great.
If
it was Joe and I out there praying on the box.
I'll never forget that with the fans running and everything. We were doing everything we could there. That was amazing. But if you want to purchase your tickets, you can call 772-492-1041. If no one answers, go ahead and leave a message with your name and return number. Or once again, you can go to VeroBeachPrayerBreakfast.com and purchase with a credit card, check, or PayPal.
That's great. We'll hope to see you there. And again, it'll be Tuesday, February 7th at Riverside Park. Doors open at 7 a.m. and we start at 7:30. You know, Dan, it's an interesting time, you know, to be a citizen in America or be, for that matter, a Christian citizen. And, you know, I think America is waking up. I really do. It reminds me of that old Charles Dickens great novel, The Tale of Two Cities, that he wrote. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with those famous words that open that great book. That was actually set in Paris right around 1789. At the beginning of the French Revolution. You know, it was a time, obviously, if you know the history of France, it was great turmoil in that country. And over here, George Washington was taking his inauguration at the St. Paul's Chapel right in New York there, next to the 9/11 event. The World Trade Centers. The St. Paul's Chapel is literally right next door and served as a refuge for the firefighters during 9/11. And it was also the same church that George Washington went for a prayer service after his inauguration. But, you know, no doubt, you know, there are many things in our great nation that are grievous. You know, there's a lot of ills still that we struggle with, ungodliness that abounds. We hear about them all the time in the news. And that's why, Dan, when you and I were talking the other day, somebody mentioned that 8 out of 10 phone calls you get, there's some kind of negative news or bad news. But we wanted to talk about the good things today because, you know, you don't hear much about the spiritual good things that are happening in America. And so we wanted to encourage you today by sharing you some of the good things that are happening in America that you really don't hear in the media much. But if you're a Christian, you realize that God is at work. He's not off on a vacation in Hawaii. He's still there superintending. He's sovereign. And he's going to help America, I believe. And, you know, not only that he's not only worked today, and we've seen him in past in history, but I'm confident that he will do even greater things in the next years ahead. I know there's a lot of concern about the future. Families are very concerned about the future. So that is what I'd like to talk about in essence. You know, what is our America's spiritual state? And as I said, obviously there's a mixture of good and bad. There's many things that are so bad we won't even talk about them on this show. Interestingly, 40 years ago, you would never heard of. Yet now they're displayed on TV screens and not to mention the motion picture theaters all over the country. But, however, God is doing some great things. And if we'd like to just step back for a minute and trying to get the big picture, because sometimes we get so involved in the details we lose what's really happening. Now, as I said, look, no doubt, look at wickedness gets more wicked. You know, evil will continue. It gets more evil, more blatant. And it does get more widespread. And but you never hear the other side on TV or the media, that godliness is also growing as well. And Christians are on the march, so to speak, and standing up for their rights. And people are in general. They want liberty, and their presence is being felt in many effective ways. We hear about it a little bit now and then. I know, Jenna, you told me about an instance recently where in Texas they were displaying a nativity and.
Right. In Athens, Texas, a group called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, it's a group that frequently targets the presence of faith and religion in the public square, was demanding that they remove the nativity from in front of the courthouse. Well, amazingly enough, and this is honestly just such a symbol to me, a sign of the revival right now that I believe is actually starting to take foundation in America's culture. Sometimes God lets it gets bad. Sometimes it gets bad before it gets better. And 5,000 supporters showed up in the town square, and their purpose was to stand firmly opposed to the attacks of the prominent atheist group, Freedom from Religious Foundation, that has waged a war on the religious display. And the media has turned this a holy war. And now we're going to listen to a quote from that rally, a clip from that rally from the pastor who spoke.
Today, we are here for one purpose, to stand together in unity with one voice, declaring to the entire world that it is time to stand up for the Christian values and principles that we so strongly believe in. The same values that Patrick Henry, the ratifier of the Constitution, said, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians. Not on religion, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. This same belief is deeply rooted in our hearts that this great nation we call America was founded upon biblical principles and a Christian worldview. This is the reason we stand today, to say together in love, but with boldness, that it is time to stand for faith, values, and morals, and lead our nation back to the God who has so abundantly blessed us.
That was Pastor Nathan's from Athens, Texas, and 5,000 people showed up, grassroots movement, to support the nativity not being removed by this atheist foundation, who is actually their entire goal, and they are all over our country, is to remove symbols of religion from anywhere in the public square. And you were talking about earlier how, there is bad news, but bad news and good news, evil and good have coexisted since the beginning of time. And I always think of George Washington with this. He said, by the all-power dispositions of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot underneath me, yet I escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions at every side. And to me, that quote from George Washington is the perfect example of bad news and good news coexisting together. God can bring the positive out of the bad. And there, he saved George Washington, even though all around him evil was happening and people were getting hurt. As Christians, we need to focus on the positive aspects and ask God to help us bring ourselves up from these attacks on Christianity.
Jennifer, the chief that was in charge of many of the Indians in that particular battle, which was Braddock's army being ambushed in the wilderness, that particular chief came up to Washington years later because his orders had been to shoot all the officers in the British uniforms, because that's how they commanded the troops. And he took Washington aside later and said, I have to meet this great warrior, all my men who never missed when they took aim, and yet we could not bring you down. You must have been picked by the Great Spirit, as that Indian would have understood it, to do great things. So even in the midst of all that evil, that Indian understood something way bigger is going on. And that's what I would encourage people to do. You know, if we sit and watch the media, you see the mass disturbing images, and it's always a lot of things, right? So you don't notice the little things. And we never see time long enough to see what God is doing. We tend to not be able to see that. We only see what we deal with in our little slot of time. And yet if we walk through history, a tale of two cities, if you want to call it that, we see St. Augustine writing the city of God, which was what? The city of God and the city of man. Rome had fallen, and it seemed like a dark age. And yet he writes a whole doctrinal treatise about the Christian church, and it begins in a huge revival into all these pagan lands, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Huns and all these very barbaric peoples, and yet Christianity explodes across Europe. And if we go a step back further, we see the days of Christ's birth, which we're celebrating right now. We see Augustus Caesar, who's really taken over the Roman Republic and is changing it from a republic to an empire, and yet Christ is born. And Christ's birth and his growing up as a young man and the miracles and his death on the cross and his resurrection changed the world forever. But yet, believe me, a lot of the world, sitting in Rome and sitting in Gaul, didn't even notice Christ was born growing up, his death on the cross. It was a small event in the history of all those people, and yet it was an event that changed everything. And that's why I encourage Christians out there to not pay that much attention to all the fear-mongering. Pay more attention to what's really going on at the family level. It's more important that fathers be turned back to their children and children back to their fathers. That's why I say it comes back to the kitchen table. If the kitchen tables are alive with the Word of God and the Spirit of God, we will take this nation back because it was designed to be taken back by interposition from the bottom up. That's called enumerated powers, limited government, the families working together and from the bottom up changing our nation or taking it back for Christ. And that is what's going on. It's never going to happen by mass politics or mass economics. It's going to happen because people start deciding to do the right things in their own homes. And it really needs to start with the people of God first. So I'm very encouraged because that's what I see going on around me. I see dads and moms re-engaging in the truths of the Word and studying it, trying to understand it and implement it in their lives, in every area of their lives, and beginning to reject many of the world's patterns and the world's normalcy. That's a term that means you get used to it being a certain way. They're beginning to reject those ideas and change and stand apart, be holy indeed. And I'm very encouraged by that, and I would like to encourage others to notice that also.
Now, if you look back over the last several centuries, we clearly see that, America was undoubtedly founded as a Christian nation, as we heard in that clip. I mean, the Supreme Court themselves made that declaration in the Trinity decision that this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation, which I'd like to talk about in the second half. But that's how we started. When the people of New England, I just got back from New England. We're doing a film up there with Kurt Cameron called Monumental that'll be released sometime around Easter time, 2012 next year, about 3 months away. And it centers on a monument up there called the National Monument to the Forefathers in Plymouth, Mass. And it tells this great story of what we're talking about, the foundation of our nation, that these people that came here to these parts of America had really one aim and purpose. And it wasn't just the Pilgrims or the Puritans saying this, but all the colonies of New England, they had one single aim. Now, not 100% of them, obviously, but the large majority of it, and they put it right in the birth certificate of America in the Mayflower Compact. And namely, that was to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sure there's many people that'd be shocked to hear that today, but that's the truth where we started. I've had the opportunity, guys, to travel around the world in this modern jet age we live in. By the way, did you hear about that new jet? They're I don't even know it's a jet. They're saying you can go coast to coast in 12 minutes.
That's amazing.
I don't know when it'll happen. Or around the world in an hour and a half. It's under design right now. Dan, I don't know if I want to be the first guy on that jet.
I think I'll let someone test fly that one.
Talk about the modern jet age. That'd be amazing. But, looking at all nations, you could vividly see that all mankind is really, really longing for the same three things. And liberty is the key. But first of all, mankind longs for liberty, both personal and at the national level. We don't want all these tentacles of government and oppressive things coming on us. And secondly, people long for prosperity, both personally and at a national level. And our economy, we're definitely got some bumps in the road right now that hopefully we'll come out of. And then third, mankind longs for peace. This time of year, at Christmas, we think of peace. And, that means escaping from the anguish and the plagues of war. Now, we just left Iraq. That was a good thing. And we're on to other achievements. And but basically, those are the three things that mankind is seeking. And, Dan, I did a little studying on the 6 great revolutions where liberty itself, without liberty, these revolutions would have never happened. And I'm talking about like the Industrial Revolution. That was one, where they developed these efficient factories and allowed mankind to begin to obtain the necessities of life, in quantity. You could do that with making cars and widgets. And then second, we had the Machine Revolution, which gradually transferred the burden of arduous work behind the plow, with an animal, to a machine power, to a big Ford tractor. I love my Ford tractor. I've got a TN75, Dan, with a 9-foot bush hog. Yeah.
I got an Oliver 880.
I love my tractor. I don't get enough time on my tractor because it's in another state. But I love my tractor. Don't mess with my tractor. But anyway, I love my tractor, and I'm going to go up and ride it soon. But then third, we had the transportation revolution, which changed, made us closely related. Now with the jet service we have, we can go anywhere in the States in 5 hours. And then fourth, we had the communications revolution, which really made us into this global neighborhood kind of, where you can get, it's amazing on my iPhone. Isn't it how you get news coverage like in an instant? Like the next day when the paper comes, it's like old news. And then, the energy resource revolution, that was the fifth one, where we found these great lakes of oil and layers of fossil fuels. We've harnessed nuclear energy, which may turn out to be the safest, cheapest energy of all. And sixth, we have the computer revolution, where these tiny chips, program circuitry, and you could store knowledge and command the machines to think and act. But the reason I'm making this point, all of these magnificent achievements over time, they'll continue to thrive only if there's a climate of liberty. That's why we call this the story of liberty. And the advantages, and if you lose religious liberty, you're going to lose economic liberty. And that's why that protest for the Nativity is so important. Folks, we'll be right back with the story of liberty in just a minute. Welcome back to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, with Jennifer Featherstone and Dan Williamson, co-host. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
You know, by the way, just a reminder, the Vero Beach Prayer Breakfast is coming up soon on February 7th. That's a Tuesday morning at Riverside Park in a huge tent. And Ann Graham Lotz, the daughter of Billy Graham, will be the keynote speaker, along with great gospel singer Wintley Phipps, providing all the inspirational music. And I know, Jenna, you're getting ready, working on that already, aren't you?
Yep, we're getting ready. If you'd like to order tickets, you can go to verobeachprayerbreakfast.com or 772-492-1041. We're looking forward to seeing y'all there at the prayer breakfast. It's going to be great this year.
Yeah, last year when Kurt Cameron spoke, and Dan, I know you spoke, that we had 2,000 people under the tent, and that was a great morning and certainly one to be remembered. And, we're talking about the building of a Christian nation, basically. The one scripture that always really hit me, that David in the Psalms 11:3, he asked the question, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And you just think of David, the great psalm writer, the king, very special man, who said that. He was asking that question. If the foundations be destroyed, what do the righteous do? Now, we're talking about the building of a Christian nation or the rebuilding of it. Now, there's no doubt in the mind of anyone who has studied historically the issue. Our forefathers built a Christian nation. Now, whatever side of the aisle you're on, whatever your beliefs are, that's a fact. But, there's several meanings that one could attach to the phrase, a Christian nation. And, that you could answer to that question that varies according to each meaning. And I'd just like to go through a few of them. And you guys jump in. Here's the question. Is the Christian teaching the primary religious system that influenced the founding of the United States? The answer is yes. There's no doubt about that. Were the majority of the founding fathers of the United States Christians who generally believed in the truth of the Bible? Yes, they were. Dan, 29 of them had seminary degrees.
That's right.
Is Christianity in all the denominations, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, non-denominational, is it the largest religion in the United States? Catholics? Yes, it is. Did the Christian beliefs provide the intellectual background that led to many of the cultural values still held by many Americans today? Yes, right? Now, these things would include such things as respect for the individual, protection of individual rights, respect for personal freedom, the value of hard work. Those are all Christian principles. Even the need for a strong national defense. We have a right to defend our nation and our families, to show care for the poor and the weak. The value of generosity, those are all good things. Even the value of giving aid to other nations. And, of course, respect for the rule of law. And I said that in the first half, the United States, the Supreme Court decision at one time affirmed that the United States was a Christian nation. In the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States in that 1892 decision. They determined we were a Christian nation. Now, Are the majority of the people in the United States Bible-believing, evangelical Christians? I don't know. I think that's a close one. It might be 50% now. I don't know the exact numbers or if you guys have them. Another question. Is the belief in Christian values the dominant perspective promoted by the United States government or the media or the universities? Well, we know that's a no, right? Now, that doesn't really determine if we're a Christian nation, but the honest answer to that is no. Now, does the United States government promote Christianity as the national religion? No, it does not. But that doesn't mean we're not a Christian nation. I mean, you don't have to profess the Christian faith in order to become a U.S. citizen, right? To have equal rights under the law in our country, you don't. So, in conclusion, you guys jump in here. Is the United States a Christian nation? Well, I think it depends on how you define it. And that list I went through, I think, proves we are, in fact, a Christian nation.
It's funny. I homeschool my children. And we were doing a Bible study the other day, and I have a 5-year-old little girl. And we were reading in Mark. And it was Mark 12:16, I believe, when they ask him whose inscription is on this coin when they're trying to figure out, who it belongs to. And they say Caesar's. Well, my daughter pulls a coin out of her pocket and she goes, well, our coin says in God we trust. And it hit me there. Sometimes it takes a 5-year-old to bring some logic to your life with all the clutter. That's what it says on our coin. In God we trust. Now, see, the thing is our founding fathers, most of them, I believe 56 of them held biblical degrees and or were pastors or went to seminary. And I always think of Thomas Jefferson. They're always calling him a deist, which, by definition means he believes God existed but did nothing in the affairs of man. And I want to know if this sounds like a deist to you. This is Thomas Jefferson. God who gave us life gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is a just God, and that his justice cannot sleep forever, that a revolution of the wheel of fortune, a change of situation, is among the possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural influence. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in this event. That, my friends, is not a deist. He specifically speaks of God interacting with us in the results of sin. And he specifically tells us that God who gave us life, gave us liberty. And can these liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove them? He's warning us there, one of our founding fathers warning us not to remove God from our country and the belief of him from our country. And it goes back as early as George Washington, who said it is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God in the Bible. I mean, John Adams, all of the founding fathers, even the ones that are claimed to be deists and non-believers, if you read history and read through them, they all claim that we cannot do it without God in the Bible.
Well, Jenna, you're very close to why we're struggling. Deuteronomy 8 says that, God's people will follow him until they become, shall we say, prosperous. And they begin to have cattle in all the hills, and they begin to forget who put them there. And I take you back in history a little bit here for just a second to have people realize that the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire or dictatorship was all accomplished during what was called Pax Romanus, the peacetime in Rome, under Augustus Caesar, the very time that Christ is born. And he has Virgil commissioned to write the Aeneid, which becomes the new Bible for the Roman children to learn and embrace an emperor who is eventually elevated to a god rather than a republic where the citizen, statesman, and soldier are really the governing force. It's when we're comfortable and we think everything's okay that the evil that's always in the world, it's always there, usually does its worst work because we don't take on those lies. We're comfortable. And that's the story of the Roman Republic. That's the story of every nation that falls. And when we can sit in America today and go into our government schools and we can be told that they are neutral when, in fact, atheistic humanism is what is actually considered neutral, and atheistic humanism has been ruled by the Supreme Court in Torcaso versus Watkins to be a religion, which means our government schools are indoctrinating our youth in a religion that is in absolute contrary to all the Christian beliefs that my ancestors, one of them signing the Constitution of the United States, Hugh Williamson, a Presbyterian minister, would have stood against. This is why we're struggling. We do not understand that there is really no separation anymore. We just plain have a different religious worldview that was carefully inculcated in many areas. Our government, entertainment, movies, literature, etc., has inculcated all these different areas of the country, and because it's becoming normalcy, it looks normal to us, we can't cipher the difference. And we need to once again go to the Word and get under the kind of teaching that can teach us those specific criteria so that we can once again cipher that difference. And like you say, you're homeschooling your children. I've, of course, homeschooled mine. You know, there is a generation of kids that whether they've been, homeschooling has been terribly successful or moderately successful, they are out of the system. They have a different way of understanding the world in which they live. There is great hope. About 1.3 million of them are getting ready to enter the workforce. And as they enter that workforce and they marry and have children, a very high percentage of them are going to choose a different path. And that path is going to be exciting to watch. We have to retake all these different areas. We need to create people who think in a Christian way to go into politics, law, economics, movie making, in every area of life to once again from the bottom up change our nation. And our founders knew this would happen. This is the part that just gets me excited. Elias Boudinot looked at the writings of Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, and he said, this is evil. And so he wrote a book, The Age of Revelation. And the reason for the book was for his daughter. So when she began to see these evil ideas making themselves known, traveling across the ocean from France, which they were heading into an atheistic revolution, he could have his daughter read this book to reaffirm her Christian walk and implement those ideas in his children and his grandchildren. Thus, we have things like the Forefathers Monument. That's why we have the sayings above the Supreme Court justices. That's why it says, in God we trust on our coins. Our founding fathers understood we would forget. We would get comfortable, we would have cattle on many hills, and we would need to have ourselves return to the first things and do them again. And that's what I see going on.
That's pretty much what Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation says. When Abraham Lincoln says, we have forgotten God, and we have forgotten the gracious hand that preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, and too proud to pray to the God that made us. And if we look back at like you said, Dan, what our founding fathers said and warned us, because they came from a place with limited to no liberty to America in order to get liberty. When they landed on Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims, they came here for religious liberty. And the thing is that, closer in the timeline, the further away in the timeline we get, the more we forget why they came here in the first place and how those freedoms are so precious. And like Ronald Reagan said, they can be lost from one generation to the next. It's not something that it's something we have to fight and work for. And that's why it's so wonderful those 5,000 people showed up in Texas to support that religious liberty. If they want to put a nativity up, they should be able to put a nativity up. There's nothing vulgar or horrible about that. It's uplifting and it's a blessing. And with the homeschooling and the indoctrination in our schools, I mean, it's happened in my family with my children several times. It's why I started homeschooling My daughter at Thanksgiving did a Thanksgiving project, and they asked her to write what she was thankful for on her turkey, on the feathers of her turkey, and she wrote God and Jesus, and the teacher made her remove those. And that was a wake-up call for me. And we have a huge homeschool community here, and the more I talk to parents, the more I find out that similar things have happened to them. And my friends from out of state, on the social networking sites, you see posts all the time. My daughter was criticized in school today because she's a Christian. And my son was made fun of on the football field for, bowing down and praying and thanking God for a touchdown. It's a shame. We need to stand up and support these kids. We need to let them know that what they're doing is a mission field. They're fighting for the right cause, and we can't let this indoctrination that they've put on our children reduce our religious liberties.
Yeah, it's all part of that misconception of the First Amendment, really. The separation of church and state. That's where all these people go back to and argue. It's interesting. John Quincy Adams was probably one of the most, if not the most brilliant presidents we ever had. I mean, here's a guy, he went over to Europe, and when he was over there, he read the Greek and Hebrew Bibles, 2 different versions of the Latin Bible, as well as 3 in French and 2 in German, and several others. I mean, this guy knew the Bible. And when Adam came back and he was involved with the American Revolution, here's what he said. He said, I'd like to have a group of college students today finish this sentence, The highest glory of the American Revolution was this. I'd like to hear the answer today. Some might say to get rid of the Stamp Act, to dissolve our relationship with England, to set us free, independent. However, that's not what John Quincy said. He said what the highest glory of the American Revolution was this. It connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. Well, that doesn't sound like separation of church and state to me, Jenna, where that teacher would not allow your daughter to explain her little art exhibit. See, that's why she did that. And, the humanists and the agnostics and all these other ticks that are out there trying to do their best to separate the principles of civil government from the principles of Christianity. But see, that's not what our founders gave us. The First Amendment, after the Constitution was written and the 10 amendments were added, we read all the comments from Joseph Story, from different people throughout history. And all of these guys that were involved made it clear that, there wasn't supposed to be this separation. I heard somebody say in this context, they said, well, the First Amendment tells us that there should be a separation of church and state. Okay? Now, I'm sure you've heard that before. Now, I'm not talking about a national government controlling a denomination like England does with the Church of England. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about this issue. But the reality is, if you ever heard that there should be a wall of separation between church and state, well, that's fairly close, except the First Amendment never mentions a wall. It never mentions separation. It never mentions a church. And it never mentions a state. Now, Dan, outside of that, it's pretty close. I don't know where they drum this thing up from. They were just talking about not having one denomination dominate. And this thing has been twisted into something totally different, where a little girl can't draw a picture of her Savior at Christmas time.
Or even write his name on a feather of a turkey.
And John, the sad part is we have exactly what those manipulators were trying to stop. They just wanted Christianity out of the public square. But nature abhors a vacuum. And that vacuum now has been filled with a new theology, atheistic humanism. Because if you walk into a government school and try to read the Bible, you have problems. If you try to move into most public offices or enterprises anywhere, you will find the old separation clause is put over the top of your head and told you can't do that. So in fact, we are allowing one theology to replace another. And yet when our founders wrote the Declaration, the Constitution, what did they say? They put King Jesus back on the throne. They remember those words in Isaiah 9 where it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." They intended Christian theology to be the whole cornerstone of our government, and because of that theology, men would have the right to speak their mind. Men would have their right to worship the way they wanted to worship, because Christ always said, "Come follow me." Every other ism says, "Come follow me," or else. And that is the difference. If we want freedom, we have to reinstitute our Christian values and principles in every area of government, and that will give everybody the freedom that they desire to do the things they like to do.
You know, Dan, it's funny because we were talking about how it's like a limit on Christianity, but no other religion. And the congressman right now can't even write Merry Christmas on any Christmas card they send out. It's a new rule that they just passed, not one. And President Obama's national Christmas tree, they took off every religious ornament off the tree. And now all the ornaments just say, "I love Obama. I love Obama. Obama is the fourth greatest president." They've removed every Christian ornament off our national Christmas tree.
But not in Wisconsin. Our governor is saying Merry Christmas on all his letterhead. I give him credit for that.
Good for him, Dan. You know, that's great. We're winding up here today and coming to the new year, and we have to examine our hearts and say, you know, what's happened to that burning flame of liberty that so moved our forebears to find this great nation? You know, I'm afraid that maybe the flame is not burning as bright as it should in America today, but there's hope. Abe Lincoln, he said that our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in what? In liberty. Our Declaration of Independence says that next to life, the most important right we have is liberty. If you look at Scripture, you'll find that most scholars agree that the major theme of the Bible is liberty. I hope you consider that as we enter the new year. Thank you for joining us, and have a happy new year. God bless.